Hello, everyone. We are kicking off 2020 with some brand new podcast interviews. This first interview is with Pat Rufo. Pat's company, RUFO Optimal Workouts, was established in 2011 to serve as an athletic consulting company for all types of athletes, especially rowers, and clients of all ages and abilities. The goal has been to fill in the gaps in their training and mindset. Pat has been a strength and conditioning coach and personal trainer since 2007 and has been involved in rowing, sculling, and coaching since 1996. His passion is to help his athletes, coaches, and clients believe in themselves and their mission. In addition, he assists parents with understanding their child's strengths and behaviors that work best for them. One final note on this interview. We originally recorded this in 2018. Since then, Pat has continued to evolve his approach and philosophy, focusing more on team dynamics, coach-athlete relationships, performance cues, and separating the athlete self from the real self. Pat and I will be doing a second interview later this spring to update you all on what he has learned as well as what has changed. With that, let's roll to the interview. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast, a podcast focused on scientific and real-world expertise on training strategies between your ears, behind the oar handle, on the field and court, and in the strength and conditioning room. I'm your host, Joe DeLeo. I am a strength and conditioning coach, speaker, and lifelong student focused on continuous improvement. Thank you for joining me, and let's roll to today's episode. Pat, good morning. Welcome from Philadelphia. Thanks so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks, Joe. It's really cold here.
I know, man. You've the Northeast has been getting hit this winter with some really kind of grim, brutal weather.
Yeah, and thankfully the river is thawed, so we're actually going to row this weekend. But like 2 weeks ago, it was kind of depressing. It was like a frozen tundra, and all my masters rowers were chomping at the bit. But attendance will be good this weekend, so I'm happy that we'll be on the water again. And let's just hope it keeps going like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very excited to have you on. We've got a really good show in store for the audience in this interview. And we're going to be kind of exploring and talking about the mental side of sport. And we'll be specifically talking about disc. So I guess a great starting point is to just sort of talk about, from an overview standpoint, one, before we even get into disc, why is kind of the mental side of sport important? Because we tend to sort of think so much on the, physicality or the fitness component and like the outputs. So let's start there, kind of addressing, why you believe that's important, and then we can get into what disc is and how it can help.
Well, I think just to back up a second, because you mentioned how, in sport as strength coaches, we're always focusing on the physical, and both you and I are FMS certified. So when we first meet someone, we're always watching on how they move. And so before we even put a weight in their hand, we're thinking to ourselves, how do they move? Are there any imbalances or any issues that prevent them from, either hurting themselves or taking away from their performance? So in my opinion, I also think that goes on the mental side. And so when we try to educate our high school athletes on how they should, get up in the morning, they should foam roll, they should stretch, they should make sure their body's balanced, they should eat right. It also is getting into the right mindset for what they're about to do. So that could be, hey, today is going to be my 1 rep max today. A lot of times we kind of just say, oh, here, go pick up that weight. And then when the athlete doesn't do well, we kind of attribute it to something physical. Sometimes it might be something mental. And what's great about the disc is that it really only looks at behavior rather than like what their personality is or their type. And in my background with process communication, which is a model, which is a personality profile, and then also the Myers-Briggs type indicator. That's a little bit deep for a high school athlete and then also deep for a strength coach. But with disc, it's, again, you're just trying to put the athlete in the right mindset for the situation. So, hey, today we're going to do an erg test. And as you and I both know, and we both experienced, when they're doing a 2K erg test, it's like, well, what's the difference between all the training that we did yesterday and today? Why all of a sudden are you behaving differently than you did yesterday? Yesterday you had a great workout, you performed well, and then today, because I say the word 2K, all of a sudden everything changes. And so that has to do with their behavior because the environment has changed. So what I use disc for is helping athletes kind of own who they are, and understand what their strengths are, and then you can kind of build this foundation of success off that. Just like with the FMS, like we start getting them, like say we're talking about rotation, we're trying to get them to first like be able to roll back and forth on the ground. Once they can do that well, then we can start teaching them how to do the Turkish get up. And when they can do the Turkish get up, then we can start putting weight in their hand. So you have to kind of build on those blocks before you just throw them, here's 50 pounds. I want you to lift it over your head. It's the same thing. Say, first you got to understand what makes you a good athlete. And then all of a sudden, get some real life examples. And when they give real life examples, they start to believe in themselves a little bit more. So that's what I use disc for. And I think that, for me, like, I'm not the only kettlebell instructor out there. There's so many great, you're my mentors, but you and I are kind of saying the same thing. We're just in different areas of the country and trying to kind of preach that. So for me, I feel like this is the next step. This is the next thing that has to be covered to help fill the gaps for athletes, especially. They're putting a lot of pressure on themselves, both in the professional level, but also high school. Like, I want to get recruited. How are you going to set yourself apart? And so that's where the mindset comes into play.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a huge part. I think it's not a area that's really kind of typically thought about from like coach to athlete or in athletic development, but it's super important. It really helps you to learn to deal with adversity and situations. It's kind of interesting. I've read some articles probably in the past couple months and talking about failure, and sort of that word. And, it's funny. It's like, when I was younger, it's sort of very binary. It was, like 0 or 1 or black and white in terms of like, it was good or bad. There was no kind of in between. And, you get older and you kind of realize that like there are things that you can take away. The training session may not have gone, in your mind perfectly as the way you wanted it to go, but there's still value to get out of that. And I think learning and accepting that, it's part of sport, but also part of life, that things are not going to kind of just work out, in a well laid out fashion. It rarely ever goes that way. So the more that you can kind of accept that and kind of roll with it, it really helps you to deal with, the challenges that come up, in a game time situation and be able to perform at your best then.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think our biggest issue now as coaches and athletes is our perception of how we're supposed to progress and get better and improve. And so when you're on a team with other athletes that are doing the same thing and they're progressing faster, you may believe that you're falling short when maybe it's the environment is not set up for you. I think that's a big challenge for all coaches, is when you have a large team and you have a training program that's really good, and then only a few athletes are really successful with it. And so then you have to decide whether, the athlete's just falling short, or maybe you have to kind of tailor the program to them. But sometimes it's just the athlete themselves, not being able to, not say handle the training, but just like you said, like I look around and I see other kettlebell instructors, hitting their 1 rep max, and I don't. What am I doing wrong? And that's not the problem. It could be mindset. So that's what I try to do with all my athletes when I first meet them, is I want to get into their heads a little bit, because maybe the performance issue has nothing to do with their physical part. If I screen them and everything looks good and nothing's telling me that that there's anything physical preventing them from doing that, then I know that must be something having to do with performance and behavior. So it's kind of neat, because then when we start talking about their disc profile, they start to make some connections to both success and failure. So, and that's what I do with you, Joe, right?
Yeah. We can talk about that a little bit later on. That's good too. Yeah. I'm still I'm still working on the 1 rep max, the half body weight military press for the SFG2. So I
Right.
haven't hit it yet. I've been making some good progress in training and stuff, and so that's good. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting your insight there.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
before we ship, I was just saying, like, what tells you you're not going to succeed
you mean like within the session or just in general?
in general?
Um, like usually, like for me, it's probably when I wake up, the like energy. Like I know if I'm going into it like and I'm tired, like I'm not, especially when you're working on the military press and stuff. Um, you need to kind of be fresh to be able to really move the heavier bells with some speed, so to
Yeah.
speak, because it's pretty tough. And so when I wake up, if I'm not fresh, I kind of like read how my body's feeling and stuff. And I'll know pretty much by the end of the warm up, like if I'm gonna have a tough time during the session, and then I'll adjust accordingly. But sometimes it can go both ways. I mean, I've had those sessions on the strength training front and then also on the rowing front where I've warmed up and I haven't necessarily felt the best, but once I actually get moving, I actually feel really, really good and I have a great training session. So the thing I think I've learned is to just kind of play it out and wait and see and not necessarily make up my mind about the outcome of the session before I even start.
And that ties right into your when we talk later. That ties right in there because for you, you have to focus on the big picture rather than the end result. The end result is going to be a result of your process leading to that. And that's why you just said when I just focus on what I'm supposed to be doing and then I get into the session, all of a sudden I realize the finish line's there. But if you think about the finish line before the workout even starts, you're almost deciding what the outcome is going to be. If that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the more I can focus on the process, that usually leads to much better training sessions, quality training sessions, and results and stuff. So I've tried to kind of get away from getting so caught up in the numbers because then it becomes like going back to the point I made earlier. It's very black or white, like
Yeah.
failure, success, or good or bad. When it's not really that way, it's like you could have a really good training session, and when you're working on things that are really towards the end of your physiological limit, or you're pushing up against that, it's going to take a long time.
Right. And that's the thing. Like you compare yourself to others because when you had to go and do like they gave you a time limit, and when you got to the time limit, like there it is, and this is the day I have to perform. But you knew in the back of your mind that you still had so much more time to do it, and so you're going to allow yourself to have that extra time. And we'll talk about that. But you and I are different because I need to see the finish line. I need to know what the goal is and not focus so much less on the process. But we'll talk about that when we talk about disc. It's interesting because you and I are different, and so if I tried to train like you, I would not be successful. If you tried to train like me, you would not be successful because we're two different types of athletes. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the cool things to talk about because we're looking at um, who athletes are and how they're different, not necessarily from a physicality perspective, but from the
Right.
behavioral perspective.
Right.
Yeah. So with that, why don't you share with the audience kind of what is DISC, how does it work, and how it can help?
So the disc profile was developed by a psychologist. His name's William Moulton Marston, and he was doing a lot of his work and research kind of around the same time as Carl Jung, who developed the Myers-Briggs type indicator. But he wanted to kind of develop a model that, in his mind, worked for quote unquote normal people, because most of the time psychologists and psychiatrists are working with people that may have some issues, but that doesn't mean that some of the concepts can't apply to people that don't necessarily have any issues. So disc was a kind of a simple way of allowing people to kind of understand their own behaviors. And um, but the interesting about it is that he never patented it. So the disc model, like if you look up disc on online, like there are a lot of different companies that use disc and use the disc profile and promote it. And that's how I kind of came across it. I worked for a company called Fit Golf here in Conshohocken, PA, and the physical therapist who was a big golfer would use the disc session for his high school athletes. And I was just fascinated because I had already done the process communication model. And as I said in the beginning, like for me, that was a little too, I always thought that would be great for athletes, but it was more personality based profile. So that's kind of getting a little bit into your history and your past. And, we have to sit down on a couch and talk about your mom and dad. And like, that's a little too deep for some athletes. And so he was talking more about with the golfers about their behavior. Like, well, what do you do before you walk up to the tee? And I was like, well, that's real simple because it's the same thing that you and I do when we teach someone the deadlift. We say, okay, let's walk. I could say walk over and pick up the weight, but if they've never deadlift before, what are they going to do? They're going to go over and walk over and pick it up wrong. So you and I demonstrate it, right? Or maybe we verbally talk about it, and so that they get it right before we have them pick up. So if I said to myself, like, that would be really great to use because it's real simple. It's really simple to talk about behaviors, and then you got to basically the way. Long story short, so I had also heard about disc from the U.S. Rowing Convention, and an former Olympian, Bo Hansen, who's a Australian rower. He had actually created a company called Athlete Assessments. So I reached out to him, and basically I got certified to learn to implement it and talk about it through Athlete Assessments. And he's great. He works with a lot of programs and colleges and stuff in Australia, but he does come to the United States with he and his wife, and they do a lot of conferences like with coaches and everything. But as soon as I started using it, it started to really help the athletes I had. And the formula that Bo Hansen uses is the situation times the behavior equals the result. So basically, you can't always change the situation. If I go out on the race course and the rowing course and it's pouring rain and it's windy and it's choppy, it doesn't matter how much time I spent in Florida with nice warm weather, I can't change the weather. Like, that's where the race is going to be. So I can decide. So if I go into the race thinking that I'm going to perform poorly, that's my behavior, right? And so then how do you think I'm going to perform? I'm going to perform poorly. But if I can change my mindset on how I'm going to handle that situation, then the performance might be better. So one of the first things I really talked about at athletes is I say, look, talk to me about the behaviors that haven't, tell me about your results and then tell me what behaviors you were kind of doing around that time. And obviously, if those behaviors aren't working well, then we have to change your behavior. So then, like I said, it makes it very simple for the athlete because, two things. One is like maybe they just don't know what behaviors lead to success. But two, maybe they're trying to behave in a way that doesn't work for them, makes them uncomfortable, kind of stresses them out. And that's when I said earlier about team culture. Sometimes an athlete's on a team where the coach or the athletes, the teammates around them are kind of behaving a certain way. Some of my high school athletes are on teams with athletes that are, let's just say, they're very aggressive. They're like, go-getters. They kind of want to like win the race all the time. They really push themselves. And this individual that I coach, he needs a little bit more time. So when the coach is like, get on the erg, pull as hard as you can, he always kind of falls apart because he's being pushed too fast too soon. And I had to help him learn. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he goes, well, because everybody else is doing that. So it's like, that same thing you say to your kid is like, well, if everyone jumps off the bridge, are you going to do the same thing? No. Okay. So then you have to talk about how he can change his behaviors within the context, because obviously the coach is still going to yell at him to go fast, but he can kind of filter that out a little bit. So we talk about that. So I have them take the profile before I meet them, and that gives me an idea of kind of where they're coming from. And usually what I do is I sit down with them and their parents. This is the high school athletes. But I also did disc, for example, I did disc with an athlete who was in his 70s, and we actually connected his disc to his performance at the Crash Bees, and he finished second in the 70-year-old category. And after talking with him that year, he went into the next year with the understanding himself a little bit better. And the funny part was that he really kind of already understood himself, but we connected to his failure to perform well at Crash Bees in his mind to basically him talking too much before. Like usually he would warm up, but he actually bumped into a friend of his and started talking, and he actually realized that he had less time to warm up, so he rushed through his warm up, and that put him in the wrong mindset for the race. So it had nothing to do with his training; it had everything to do with what he had done leading up to the Crash Bees.
Interesting. Yeah. So that sort of deviation from his normal warm up routine, the behavior that he did on that particular day.
Right. And again, like you have to talk. That's part of this process is actually talking about the performance, because a lot of times, think of a bad performance you had in rowing or in training. It's like you just kind of like want to scrap the session, instead of actually breaking it down and reviewing like maybe where it might have gone wrong. And that's how we grow. That's how we get better. You and I can like talk to a client. We're in a session with the client and we can see when they fatigue, and we have to try to reassure them that they're not bad athletes. It's like, no, you're tired. Like you're not going to, I'm not letting you lift anymore because you're going to hurt yourself. And they get really mad because they want to keep going. They don't think they're tough.
Right. Right. And then you get a little bit older and then you learn a little bit more and you
Yeah.
realize it's good to sometimes just put the bells down or put the handle to the erg cage and leave it on the shelf for the day, because sometimes it's just not there. Like there's other, like you said, it's behavior for sure, but sometimes you're just tired, there's
Yeah.
tons of other variables.
And I'll share a quick story. Like when I was at the SFG1, we were doing loaded carries in a circle, and everybody in front of me was like really pressing the weight overhead and locked out, and I was kind of pressing the bell overhead, and like obviously I was fatiguing, but I was kind of like, no, I'm going to keep this thing up here. And I can't remember the assistant. He came over really quietly, whispered in my ear, and he basically said he didn't say this exactly. He basically said, "Don't be a hero." He's like, "Put the damn bell down." I was like, "Oh, you're right." Like, but that was my behavior, was like I see all these other instructors like keeping the weight overhead, and so my pride kind of took over and I was competing with them. But like he could see that like my shoulder was starting to get jacked up by my ear and I was trying to force it up there. And so he didn't yell at me, but he kind of was just like, cut the shit. So I don't know if I can swear on the podcast. So
No, you can. Yeah.
okay, yeah. He said he's basically cut the shit, put the weight down.
Right.
And so I had to like look at that statement and decide if he didn't like me or not. You know what I'm saying? But no, he's trying to keep me safe. But I was only doing that because I saw everybody else doing that,
Right.
keeping the weight up overhead.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great point too, right? So we get into those competitive environments, and our natural tendency as an athlete is to try to sort of match the what other athletes in the environment are doing and kind of bring ourselves up to that level. But on that particular day, or our current ability level may limit or prohibit us from doing it. And so there's that. And I think probably a really important distinction between like cardiovascular endurance activities versus stuff you do on the strength training front is like when you get tired, when you're like rowing or running or cycling or any of those, you just sort of slow down. Your body kind of kicks in naturally. It's like, yeah, you're tired. We're gonna pump the brakes. But like the difference is like you can try to start kind of grinding or pushing through with weight, and then your technique or your form breaks down, and that's kind of when bad things can happen and you can get hurt. So it's a little bit different in that regard, in that your body will naturally put the brakes on some of the cardiovascular activities, and then with the weight, there's not necessarily that happening sometimes.
And to your point, but then the question I would ask as the coach is like, well, why did Pat try to keep pressing the weight overhead, even though he's a strength coach, he knows not to hurt himself. It's because of the situation. I was at the SFG1 and I'm trying to press, and so the stakes were higher. And when the stakes are higher, we don't behave necessarily the way we're supposed to. And that's that's that anxiety you feel when you're going into a situation where you have to kind of prove yourself. So I don't blame the SFG certification, like that's part of the process, like seeing who not the, well, I wouldn't say the smart guys are, but who the people that are like, real, that should be coaches or not. So when I failed the SFG one the first time, I had to like kind of take a little bit of humble pie, and they gave me really good feedback. And that's why I kind of approached, I took my time, and I actually, was able to nail everything, a month or two later. But let me, for your listeners, just let me go over DISC just so they kind of understand what DISC stands for. So DISC is DISC. D stands for dominance, and it's how we approach tasks. So when we're talking about life in general, it's, I like to use the fire alarm analogy. If I was at your house right now and all of a sudden it burst into to flames, and you're like, we have to get out of the house. And I'm like, here, let's jump out the window. What would you say if I said, let's jump out the window? I mean, I've never been to your house, but what would you say?
I'd hope we're on the second floor because it's not that bad. It's probably only 10 feet, so it's doable.
Okay, but let's say we're in a 5-story building. You're going to say, no, let's see if we can find a better way out. I did this with a high school athlete last night. He was like, no. So people with the high D are very like spontaneous. And high doesn't mean like better or worse. It just means to degree. So people that have a high level of dominance are very quick to make decisions. So like in my case, like, I'm like, let's jump out the window. It's a very rash and risky decision, but it could be the best one. But but someone who is a lower D is going to look at that and say, well, wait a minute, is this the best decision possible? So people with the low D tend to hesitate a little bit more in those situations. It doesn't mean that that's the wrong thing to do, but sometimes hesitation can also be bad. So that's why you can see there's no better or worse. When we talk about sports, I would use a rowing example. So if you have my athletes that are high D are pretty easy. Like, I'll say, okay, today we're going to do steady state, and they immediately jump on the machine and start pulling right away. And I'm like, oh, whoa. Like, I need to tell you how fast you need to go and, what the intensity is. Don't just start pulling steady state. So, but they get very impatient because they just want to get going. They want to get started. And the athletes that are low D are the ones that are like, well, coach, what heart rate we're supposed to be at? What stroke rate we're supposed to be at? And they're also the ones that, like, just before we're about to start the piece, will raise their hand and ask one more question. You have those athletes. I stands for influence, and it's how you relate to people. So I always use the party example. So Joe, if we went to a party, you came back out to Philly, and I was going to introduce you to some of my friends, would you like be the life of the party? Hey, what's going on? Or would you kind of stand back and observe and, get to know, maybe talk to one person before you like decided you wanted to kind of engage with everybody?
Probably stand back and talk to one person first.
So people with the high I are very like, it's very easy, very personable. Doesn't mean like they're like fun and stuff like that, but they tend to be more chatty. They want to get kind of know you on a personal level, and they're very intuitive in terms of like, especially in team sports with their teammates. Like they're kind of always looking to work with their teammates. People with a lower I doesn't mean at the party that you don't want to have a good time. It just means like you're not ready to like, tell your life story to people you've never met before. So if we use the CrossFit example, one of the reason I think people like CrossFit is for the purpose because of the community. It's that mentality of like, hey, I'm not just working out by myself. I'm working out with all these other people, and so that kind of helps drive and motivate me. But at the same time, like there's some people who don't like CrossFit for that reason. Do you like CrossFit or not? I don't want to put you in a spot there, but
no. I mean, I don't have anything against it. I think anybody that's trying to improve their movement and their fitness and be more healthy is good.
You stop right there. That's why that's why you respect it, but doesn't mean you're going to go join a box, because in your mind, what would you rather do? You'd rather train with people or by yourself, right?
Yeah, and that's probably more of a like philosophical difference in approach to methodology and how you want to go about your training, training style and practice.
And that's fair. But if out in where you live now, everything was CrossFit and there was no kettlebell places, how would you feel about that?
Well, I'd either have to adapt or I'd probably be training on my own.
So hold on to that word adapt. So that word adapt is what we're going to talk about after we finish the letters. So that's what influence is. So and there's people with an high influence can kind of like, you know, talk, but also kind of be serious at the same time. And those with the low I, like they're not going to necessarily share everything during their training session or the race. If we use the rowing example, they're the athletes that are talking in the boat. They're rowing along and all of a sudden they're like, hey, look, it's a bird. It's like, dude, focus on the rowing. Stop looking at the bird, S stands for steadiness, and it's how you approach the pace of your tasks. So I always use the taxes example. So tax season's coming up. So people with the high S have already started getting all their W-2s and 1099s together, and they've already met with their accountant, and they're basically all set to go because they want to make sure there's no issues, before it's time to get their taxes in. People with the low S wait to do their taxes the week before or the last week. So if you think about if you have students in your facility, they're the athletes with the high S again are the ones that are going to look for more information before they start something. They want to make sure they have like kind of all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. Mm-hmm. Where the low S athletes are going to be like, oh, okay, like what do you want me to do? Pick up this kettlebell, and you're like, whoa, stop! You're not picking it up correctly. You have to show them how to do it right. Again, it's not that they don't want to know the steps. It's just like they want to keep it simple, for themselves. They don't need this long, drawn out explanation on how to do it, and I'll use a rowing example. One of my athletes was in the boat. My master's athletes in his 50s were rowing along, and I was talking about why he had to put his hands down on the recovery. And I was like, oh, if you put your hands down, then your body might pitch forward, so you have to sit up tall. And I just kind of kept going on, and all of a sudden he's like, so why don't you just tell me to put my hands up? I don't really care. And I was like, oops, I forgot. Like, he doesn't need to hear all the details. He just needs me to tell him what to do. Sometimes when we coach, we tend to either overcoach or undercoach based on the situation. And then finally, C stands for conscientious, and that has to kind of do with the rules of the sport or how you kind of look at the big picture. So athletes at high C will look at the big picture. They're very good at kind of connecting what they're doing. So you say, we have to deadlift. And your athletes are like, why? And when you explain it to them, they kind of understand, oh, if I deadlift, I'm using my hamstrings and my glutes. It helps strengthen my core, and it makes me better and stable in all my extension like exercises. And so they're like, oh, I get it. Whereas someone with a low C doesn't really care why they have to do the deadlift. They'll just do it because you say they're to do it, or they'll do it because it looks fun. Or, I just like I want to beat the guy next to me. Like, what's he deadlifting 300? Okay, I want to go 305. So that's a matter of motivation. Would you say you have some athletes that don't really care about like why you have to do something? They just want to know what the workout is and the exercise is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's some of those in every group. They just sort of come in, more than willing to work hard and do the work and stuff, but they don't want to know the details. They just want to come in. It's almost, they look at it almost like as homework. It's like get it done.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can be tough because if you're a coach, we're trying to educate, and we want them to not almost know what we know, but like sometimes it can be frustrating. And I'll give you an example. Like my favorite example is in the kettlebell community when you go to the certification, and I always love watching people pick up the kettlebell wrong and then get yelled at by the instructors, because like that's like a basic unwritten rule in kettlebell community. Like you pick up the kettlebell like you're deadlifting every time, right? But then you'll watch some person go over, grab the 80-pound kettlebell with one arm and like be kind of like hanging, letting it hang down. And then someone like, Phil Scarito will go over and be like, that's not how you're supposed to pick the kettlebell up. So, it almost disqualifies them immediately. I just remember that at my SSG. It was like, we were like, everyone was carrying the kettlebells like really particular because they didn't want to like make any of the instructors mad because they were afraid that they're going to get thrown out. So athletes, so Strong First is a very mission-oriented organization. I mean, that's why it's the best, I think, because it holds everybody to a very, very high standard. So athletes or coaches who are high C hold themselves to very high standards in their teammates. And that's good. That can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing depending on the situation. So that's DISC. And you had mentioned earlier about adapted states. So once we have I have an athlete take a profile. They get a report. It's a 44-page report. It's pretty extensive, and there's a lot to delve into. But there's a lot in there that you can digest. And when I took my DISC, I took it, about 4 years after I did the Olympic trials. And what was really cool for me is when I took it I put myself in the mindset of how I felt when I was training for the Olympic trials. And when I took the DISC and I looked at it, I'm like, this is me. And it was really cool to see that like I hadn't really changed that much since then. But it also helped me connect why I didn't succeed. And that almost kind of gave me a little bit of peace of mind, because yes, it's disappointing when you fail, but at the same time, you kind of realize that like it wasn't all for nothing. And so, but what one of the two things you had mentioned earlier was that when an athlete's under stress, it's how they kind of root themselves in their, what we call their natural style. So when we're in the zone, that's what people talk about, trying to get into the zone. When you perform at a high level, you're in the zone, you're in your natural style. If you're under stress, you had said you're adapting to the situation. So if I said, Joe, you have to go train at my CrossFit facility, you'd be like, okay, I'll do that because I like you, but I don't necessarily want to go. And then if I start talking to you about how foam rolling is BS, you're going to be like, okay, I'll deal with that too. But eventually you're going to not want to train with me anymore, because I totally contradict kind of what your philosophies are. Would you agree?
Yeah, I never thought about it that way, but that's a good point. It's interesting how you can communicate on a subconscious level over time that can affect how somebody's going to, train with you, or whether they want to continue working with you and influence their behavior. So it's interesting to think about that.
And think about a high school athlete that you might have, and you may have all the sound philosophies in the world, but if they don't agree with you, or if they don't like your coaching style, then they'll stop training with you, even though you might be the best trainer out there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I try to help athletes work, because again, like when they're not successful, they're quick to either blame themselves or blame somebody else. So we have to figure out why, and that's what the profile helps do, because we can have honest conversations. And again, for those that might think, well, this is a little deep, it's not, because again, like we educate athletes on what they need to eat, maybe how they need to kind of take care of themselves. And it's the same that goes with mindset. If you kind of start the day off in the wrong mindset, then like you said, you're probably not gonna perform well. If you let the rain bother you. So I'll give you a quick example with my high school team. I kind of did a little mini disc session. None of them have taken it. A few of them have. But I asked them basically that question. I said, like, what happens if it's a practice and it's raining? How do you feel? And they're like, oh, practice might go well. And then I went to the Stotesbury Championship, and like the whole team was like, oh, we'll do horrible. And I was like, all right. I'm like, then why are we even training? Because if you're going to let the rain be the only reason why you're not successful, that seems to be an easy fix. So when I kind of put it in that perspective, then they started to realize like they do let their behaviors affect their performance. And It doesn't matter how much I train them. Like I said, they could all be sub 8-minute girls, and where they can lift kettlebells over their head, but then they can go into the race, and just a simple rainstorm could just totally throw them off. And if you've read any books on other mental training sport, like they talk about this. Like one of my favorite books is the Mental Game for Tennis, and they talk about how tennis players have to, if you have a long volley and you lose it, you can't focus on, like, you can't dwell on the past shot. You got to move forward, right? So
Yeah.
they give you techniques on how to kind of move forward. Well, the same applies to any sport, workout to workout, race to race. And so the disc kind of helps guide you along with that, because you recognize what behaviors work for you. So I try to help athletes kind of root themselves. And you and I talked before your SFB.
Yeah, that's right. I think that was right around when I did the disc.
Yes. So tell me how that helped you after we talked. And if it didn't, it's okay, but hopefully it helped you a little bit.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned earlier, but I'm like definitely very detail process oriented. Um, so what was interesting is it sort of kind of, I guess, made me more aware of some of my tendencies and behaviors, um, and like, what is kind of important to me, or what I need to do to kind of set myself up for success, and then also kind of how I can um, limit my success by, um, you know, anxiety or kind of overthinking some things or starting to focus on the result too much when, if I stick with the process and put in the plan, put in the work and follow the plan, you know, it may take a certain amount of time and it may not necessarily meet my initial timeline or expectations of how long it'll take, that eventually I'll get there. And I think that was kind of one of the biggest things I walked away with, is to definitely continue to trust the process, but realize that you need to be very flexible in the timeline, because it doesn't always work out, the way you want it to. And that was kind of a major shift because, with rowing, a lot of it is so much tied to, a race on a certain day at a certain time. And when you're working on some of these skills that we're talking about, like a one arm, one leg push up or half body weight military press, um, you're like, yes, those are tied to the certification weekend, but they also give you an additional, 3 to 6 months for some of those to hit them. So, they also realized that when they came up with these standards, that it takes a long time physiologically to hit some of these benchmarks, to hit some of these standards. And so for me as an athlete, what I've learned is that doesn't mean you fail if you don't get it, on that particular day. You just have to do a lot more work. So it's really sort of, changed my behavior. I when I went to the SFB, I didn't hit that one arm, one leg push up that weekend. I actually didn't go deep enough, and I ended up getting it 4 months later during the summer. And I went into the SFG2 a year later, knowing that I hadn't even hit one rep with the 40 kg yet. And I knew I wasn't going to probably do it at the weekend, but I didn't let that ruin my experience at the weekend. I had a phenomenal time. I was smiling, I was laughing, met a lot of great people, saw some familiar faces there that I know in the Strong First community. So for me, what it allowed me to do was, really kind of mature quite a bit as an individual and as an athlete, and realize that, yes, I'm not where I want to be currently. I still have some work to do, um, and just kind of be more open to that process and how long it's going to take.
And let's just talk about your SFB for a second, though.
Sure.
We you and I had talked about what happened, and I want to talk about the
Hmm.
in-game thing that happened. What happened just before that rep fail? You told me, I remember this, but I want to see if you remember. You said, like, when you were about to do the test, something happened that prevented you from, like, getting the rep. Like someone talked, or it was loud, or you didn't hear the instruction. It was a moment. You probably don't remember, but I remember this.
No, I don't remember. Yeah, go ahead, jog my memory. Feel free.
So it was something along the lines of, I don't know how many attempts you got, but something happened where you didn't get your feet set or something like that. And then so in that moment, that's when you shifted to your adaptive state. And so, like, when you're, and the shifts are important. So when you look at your disc profile, like, you're gonna see two graphs, and I don't know if you probably don't have your profile in front of you, but I have it. There's two graphs, and what happens in your profile is, like, something goes up and something goes down. And so in which case, when your setup wasn't right, and you kind of messed that attempt up, what would, I mean, again, try to go
Oh
back.
yeah, that's right. So what happened is, um, I um, I went down to descend into the bottom of the one arm, one leg push up position, and like immediately lost, um, like positioning. So I wasn't staying square to the floor with my
Yeah.
shoulders and hips. I kind of like rotated. Um, so
And
then
so
I
in that
shook,
moment,
yeah.
go ahead.
No,
So
I
in that,
shook it off, and then got I got one more attempt, and the second rep I stayed stable, but I didn't go deep enough.
however, so but this is the part that I think this is what makes it really fascinating. So in that moment, that's like the Super Bowl for you, like
Right.
because you're saying like I only got one more rep, and you're also frustrated with yourself because I'm sure you were frustrated because you were like, why did I shouldn't have messed that up. You know what I'm saying? Like I should have got it the first time. So maybe you didn't think that, or maybe you still don't think that now. But if I looked at your adaptive state, so I don't know if you have your profile in front of you.
I do not. I do not.
Oh, okay. Well, do you remember what your highest behavior was out of the four?
Um,
So D, I, S, and C.
yeah, I know. I don't think I know I wasn't a high D. I think I was a high. Was it I or
High C.
yeah,
So you're
C? That
very
was my second
process,
guess. Yeah.
and if anyone's been listening, they that's no, they said so. Athletes with a high C are focused on process. They have good planning. They do things the right way the first time. They want to know the why behind things. Like if I say, "Hey, Joe, here, eat this," you're gonna be like, "Well, why?" Like, "Well, because it's really nutritious." Well, what data do you have to back that up? Okay, if I give you all that information, do you agree with that? If I give you all that
Yep.
information, you'll eat it. But
Yep.
if I just say, "Here, eat this," you're like, "No, dude, like I'm not gonna eat it." So as a high C, up to that point at the SFB, you had everything set. Everything was planned all the way up till the moment, the time, the rep, and then for some reason, like again, like it was not maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was just a setup issue. All of a sudden, that got kind of thrown off. And so what happened in your profile is in your natural style, your C is pretty high, but then what happens is when you're under stress, whether it's physical, mental, your C goes up, which means you're going to think more about how to do it correctly versus execution, and
Hmm.
that's your D. So your D doesn't go down, but it definitely affects your D because it kind of clouds it. So D is dominance, how you approach the task. So if I say, Joe, I just want you to lift this heavy kettlebell, and you're gonna be like, no, I got to warm up first, right? I got to make sure that like I don't injure
Yep.
myself,
Yep.
right? So so that's what happened to you. And so we talked about that. And I said, well, look, like, don't frustrate about because there was nothing wrong with your process. It was just something that you hadn't planned for. But now you get to control your environment again. Because the SFB, you can't control the environment. You have to go when the instructors want you. Would have
Correct.
been
Yeah.
better if you had known like when exactly what time you would have gone like and done your point. If they said, Joe, you're going to do your one arm push up exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, and you'll be the first one to go, would that have helped a lot?
Um, Probably at that point in my life, I would have said yes. I think one of the things I've tried to work on, and it'd be interesting to see if my disc has changed at all, is um, kind of being, again, going back to the adaptability, realizing that like, there might be a set date and time for a race or something, but there, like we talked about earlier, weather factors or other factors that come into play that you can't control. So I've tried to do a better job, in the last year and change of kind of rolling with things a little bit more. But at that point in my life, yeah, definitely that would have helped me more.
So you've grown because you've become more adaptable, and that again, it doesn't necessarily mean your disc has changed. It just means you've increased your capacity to adapt, right?
Hmm.
That's what we're trying to do in the situation. I wanted to share my story at the SFG too. I did not pass that as well. Did not get the press, and I went into it not knowing whether I could do it or not. Um, but I had already taken my disc, and I kind of knew, what my deal was. And I think the tough part for me at the SFG too is like again, I didn't have give myself enough time to prepare for the press. So I kind of, and they encouraged me to go. So I said, I'll go because I need to learn. Like that was why I wanted to go. But the hilarious part about it was we got to the bent press and I never done it before. And what I had asked you before is like, could you guess what I am based on like our conversation? I mean, you never knew me as a rower, but like, would you say like, I definitely am not you in terms of like my C being my highest. So what would you say I was? What would you think my
Oh,
high?
what's your high letter out of disc?
As an athlete, yeah.
Um,
You don't have to.
well, you're more like I'm more about the process. You're kind of more the end result. So
Yeah.
my guess is you'd be on the opposite end. So D.
So I'm a high D. So we both hold each other for high standards, but I'm more about just getting things done. So this is the story about the bench press. So I knew that about myself, so what happened was they taught us the bench press, and I was so excited to learn something new because it was challenging and everyone was kind of learning it out. Like we were warming up, and I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go try to press this 96-pound kettlebell over my head because I'm like, I know how to do it now. I'm just gonna try. And so I go over. And up to that point, I've never pressed anything like even in the get up, I couldn't do the 40 kg. And so I went up and I just banged it up like with no issues at all. And then I was so excited, I kept doing it. And then everyone kind of saw me doing it. And I can't remember who my lead instructor was, but he was like, okay, stop. You can't keep doing that overhead. I said, yeah, but it's so fun. And so then he kind of brought me back to reality and then I couldn't press it again. And if you asked me to do it today, I couldn't, but I was totally feeding into my high D because I was like, hey, this is something nobody's trying right now. I'm just going to go and try and do it. So that was what made me think, okay, well, I could definitely learn how to press, half my body weight, but I can't just go to the certification and just do it. And so that's the trouble sometimes being a high D athlete is that like, I'm very willing to kind of put myself out there, but at the same time, like, and that's what I realized over time. And I guess we can segue into how, it gets more and more difficult when you become an elite athlete to kind of make the right decisions because the stakes are higher. I mean, that's where you talk about a lot of Olympians or even professional athletes about luck because for me, like if I want to press this kettlebell, then I'm going to have to take the time and really train and prepare for it. I can't just walk into the situation and hope it's going to work out. Um, and that's part of like kind of growing. Like I have to sit and find time in my busy life to like put in the the reps so that I can build up my press and do that. But as a D athlete in college, thinking back in college, like that's how I was successful in rowing was, someone kind of lit a fire under me. And I just decided that I was just going to beat everybody on the team. And that's what I did at University of Massachusetts. Like I just basically made myself the fastest guy. And after I graduated, well, a couple of things is like my teammates weren't as fast as I was, and so that made me think, oh, they're not as dedicated. And it's like, no, like you just kind of like rose the bar for yourself. So I was so anxious to get get off the team that I got in the single. I'm thinking I'm going to go to the Olympics and I'm going to be so good. And basically, I ran myself into the ground training because I was pulling hard all the time, and when you get older, your max heart rate goes down, and so I learned that about myself. I learned that part of my reason I wasn't successful, making the national team at all is because I didn't know how to train correctly, and that's what drove me to go back to school because I wanted to learn what I had done wrong. But it gave me nice closure because it's a story I can tell, and I can tell athletes not to. They have to, you can't just be one thing. You can't just be super competitive. You can't just be super process oriented. You have to kind of have good balance in your life. And that's what the disc allows you to fill the gaps. Maybe you need to work a little bit more on being adaptable in your case. Like you said, like now you kind of go with the flow, but maybe a couple of years ago, you would have been very like regimented, right? And
Oh
very
yeah.
and so you had to learn to adapt to the situation. So now you can take that experience and share that with your athletes. And you have a good story to kind of back it up. And you have your disc to kind of reinforce that instead of just kind of guessing, you know. And that's the thing. Like, I don't want my athletes to guess. And so I've been fortunate since I've been doing disc to be able to help athletes kind of on their journey. I worked with an athlete a couple of years ago who kind of was in a bad place, and it took a little bit of while to kind of pull her out of that, kind of like not believing in herself. And then when she kind of realized that, she needed to kind of create a good environment for herself and train under her conditions, it allowed her to advocate herself. And so now she's in a better position to be able to, work with a coach that might necessarily not gel with her, but she's willing to adapt now versus, kind of like letting the coach kind of push her around. So and again, that's just us talking about her profile and kind of like setting her up for success. And this athlete was a high I athlete. So one of the things that it really is important with her is that she needs to have fun. And if practice isn't fun, then she's going to kind of like it's going to get worse and worse for her. So I made a joke with her. I was showing her the foam roll, and she was just like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't foam roll yesterday. I was supposed to." And I said, "Well, why didn't you foam roll?" And she's like, "Well, I know I'm supposed to do it." And I said, "Well, look," I said, and her dog was there, and I said, "Well, you wouldn't neglect your dog, right?" And she goes, "Yeah," and she laughed because like she loves her dog. And I said, "Well, then I want you to treat your foam roller like a pet." And I took a marker and I drew a face on the foam roller, and then I gave it to her, and I said, "I want you to give this foam roller a name." And so she made up some funny name, and I was like, "It's like your stuffed animal." And so then she started foam rolling because all of a sudden, like every time she saw the foam roller, it made her laugh, and so it connected her why she had to do it versus, you know, just being like, "Oh, this is something I have to do." You know what I'm saying? It became work. So these are the kind of things that like I get to do on a daily basis with my athletes. Because it's not like I don't know how to train them. It's just I have to figure out how to get them to do the things I need them to do to get faster or stronger.
The beauty of the disc profile is that it's different for each athlete.
And one more thing about it too, like, you know, the thing that I think coaches are challenged with, and I'll use rowing coaches, is that, you know, because I deal with them mostly, is that, you know, no one's questioning their ability to coach or teach technique or teach rowing or even be successful. But I think coaches can tend to limit the potential of having some really talented athletes because they may not necessarily be willing to adapt themselves. And so there's the athlete disc, but then there's also the coach disc. And so my coach disc is actually different than my athlete disc.
Oh,
So
cool.
yes. So I want you to guess what my coach disc might be based on our conversation now, because we're talking to each other as coaches. And so if you look at the four styles, like what am I doing a lot of during this podcast?
We're talking a lot about sort of the bigger picture, the process and stuff. So
Yep.
you're kind of on the opposite end as a coach than you are as an individual athlete.
Again, and that's true. And I'm also a little nervous because I'm doing a podcast with you. So I'm like, oh, I want to make sure I get my information across. So actually, in my adapted state as a coach, I'm a higher C, higher S. So
Wow.
I make sure I want to give the details. But I also like to infuse a little bit of humor into my coaching. And that's what I said after we got off for a second. I was like, oh, I got to make sure I bring the jokes. Because to
Right.
me, I'm more of an I coach. That's why I'm always asking questions. I always ask questions about you. I'd rather hear what you have to say than me, even though you're interviewing me, because I can connect to you better when I kind of know what you're thinking.
Sure.
So my earlier point, it's like coaches have to know what they are, and so I do work with some coaches too. And when they take the coach disc, they realize like, okay, like I know what I'm doing, but I have like one athlete that I'm having trouble with, and so we'll talk about that athlete. And I say to the coach, I say, look, like what is the end result you want? Well, I want the athlete to be successful, but they're not doing what I want. And it's like, well, yeah, but is it about you or is it about them?
Right.
Them. Okay, then you need to adapt to them. Like it might be very difficult to coach somebody who is a high D athlete. Now I'll share the story of this high school girl I work with. So I did a seminar, a camp with Sparks Consulting. I know you know them.
Hmm.
We had the athletes take the disc profile, and this one girl, she was from a high school, and she hadn't PR'd on her 2K and a long time. And we sat down with her disc profile. And so the day before the last day of camp, the director said, well, I want everyone to do a 2K because I want it to show that the camp worked. And I was like, I don't know if that's a good idea because I don't think they're ready, but we decided to do it anyway. So all the other kids who were like more S and D were like, okay, let's do this. Like the S's were like, well, what's the race plan need to be? You know, let's go over splits. What splits do we need to do? The D's were just like, oh, I don't care. I'm just going to go and race it. I'm just going to try to be my best time. So this one girl was a high I, and she came over and she sat down with me to go over her race plan, and she just kind of stared and she's like, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know what to do at all. And she was like really nervous. And so I looked at her and I started to kind of I was about to go into this pacing chart, you know, like, oh, go, you know, +1, +2 for your 2K. And then I realized I'm trying to coach her like I'd want to be coached. And so I said to her, I go, you don't need a race plan. And she looked at me and she goes, I don't. She goes, no. I said, you don't have to need a race plan. I said, you'll figure it out. I said, in fact, I'm going to give you incentive. And she goes, what? She was like, I said, I will buy the whole team donuts if you do really well in your 2K. And she started to laugh, and like her whole demeanor changed. And she started laughing. She's like, no, you won't. I said, yeah, I will. And I said, in fact, I'll eat a donut, even though I had just preached about nutrition. I said, I will eat a donut, and you get to pick what donut I eat. And she goes, oh, coach, you need to eat the croissant donut because it's like awesome. I said, okay, cool. So the next day, I walked into the room with all the other kids, right? And I walked in with this big $12 a dozen donuts and a balloon. And she starts dying laughing. She gets on the erg. She PRs by 6 seconds. We didn't talk about pace. We didn't talk about race plan. We didn't talk about anything. She just was happy that I was there for her and kind of made the situation light. And I was able to kind of diffuse the stress that she had. And it was so funny because like she, out of all the other kids, did the best.
Wow.
And she's still rowing in college now. And I'm actually working with her sibling now. And her sibling is different, but it's just so great because like she's still doing well. Like, so she's owned herself, and that's awesome. You know,
That's great, man. That's fantastic.
yeah,
Awesome stuff. Um, and that's really interesting to show, what you need to communicate really depends on, that individual and how their disc profile aligns. So kind of having that information as a coach can be really powerful because it sort of goes beyond, the numbers, and it starts getting into like, okay, what's going to be the most effective way to help lead this athlete to success? So it's a great tool. I really appreciate you, coming on and sharing it and talking about it. So, where can people kind of learn more about DISC and learn more about you and find more information about these tools?
yeah. To your point, I mean, it is a powerful tool because if you have your team take it, you can almost group them accordingly to their disc profile. And two things can happen. One is and that's what I'm doing now. I'm doing it with my team, and I sometimes
Hmm.
group the training sessions based on what they are because they can kind of lean on each other a little bit, but then also you can kind of put them with others that are different so they can kind of get exposed to different ways of setting goals or achieving goals to help them adapt in those situations. Because in rowing, like you're looking at the erg score, so you put the 8 best ergs in the boat. But then what if you have a D that's stroking and you have a C behind them saying, so the D is like looking around and going, oh, race, we got to go. And the C is like, no, focus on the race plan. So I attribute a lot of the success and failure of some of these college teams and even the Olympic teams to sometimes just coming down to the mentality of the moment. You can, like I said, so what I do now is I have a website. My website's RUFO OPTIMAL WORKOUTS.com. You can reach me there. You can also reach my personal email. I think you'll have it in the show notes. But I'm kind of a hands-on coach. So like the best thing I like to do is like actually talk to you on the phone. So, if you want to you can put your cell phone there, my cell phone on there, Joe, if you want.
Sure.
But like I do strength training just like you, kettlebell training just like you. I said, but like for the most part, like what I try to do is kind of integrate all that. I use it with my masters rowers, and they're fun. They're fun to work with on the disc side of things because a lot of times I have to kind of check myself because they're older than me, so they want to make sure that I know my place. But at the same time, I know how to motivate them and kind of get them pointed in the right direction. It's no different at the master's level than it is at the high school level. And in fact, sometimes it's worse because we had talked before we started here. As we get older, we start wearing different hats. So first we're just rowing and training, and then we're coaching and training, and then all of a sudden we're married and we have kids, and now we're wearing like 5 different hats. So it gets more difficult as you get older to kind of like get back to who you are, and that's I had mentioned real quick, so I have a hashtag that I like to promote. It's called Rebuilding a Rower. And basically, I'm finding myself working with rowers who want to kind of get back into the sport. And it's fun because we do the disc and then we kind of talk about why they were successful as a rower. And then we kind of we kind of integrate that into their training sessions. And so we find that motivation for them to kind of train again. They have to be realistic. They're not going to row as hard as they did when they were in college, but they remember why they enjoyed the sport in the first place. And so, like I have a rower who I'm training right now who rowed for an Ivy League program who hadn't been in a boat in 20 years. And we went out on a double, and he was just so happy. He was so excited. So now his whole sole motivation is to train and just get back in the boat so he can just do that as he's retired. So that's what I'm doing now, and I really enjoy it.
Awesome, man. That's fantastic. I'll make sure to include all that information in the show notes, and that way people can learn a little bit more about you, and if they're interested, contact you and get a disc profile done.
Yep. And we can do it right online. So if you don't have to be in state. I have clients out of state or even other countries that I've done with disc with. So, if you're an athlete looking to kind of take it to the next level, it's pretty simple. The profile I can get the profile to you within 24 hours.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, Pat, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. If this content is important to you, please be sure to rate and review so more people can listen. Also, you may follow me on social media, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook to get weekly free content. For more in-depth content, please subscribe to my email newsletter at my website, leotraining.io. Be sure to check out the resources page to download free, helpful content. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact me directly by email at joe@leotraining.io or via Instagram. The handle is @leotraining. Thank you again for listening and have a great day.